Welcome to Crossroads. The State Department is now advancing its policies against mass migration globally. It is now deeming this a threat to Western civilization and making this an actual policy. Now, in addition to this, the United States is also changing its policies on humanitarian aid in the United Nations, changing the whole thing. And the goal, according to the State Department, is to save lives with less money. And also, on a related topic, ICE just got access to all the data on Medicaid. I'll be talking about these topics and a lot more today. Make sure to hit the like button, leave a comment. Let's jump into it. Now, look, first of all, something big is happening. The State Department is actually now moving forward with its policies globally against mass migration, which it deems a threat to Western civilization. They're also calling it basically abuses of basic human rights caused by people migrating to other countries in mass numbers. Let me show you the State Department saying. It says mass migration and the criminal networks that enable it wrought havoc on America before President Trump secured the border. It says the State Department is now instructed U.S. embassies in countries in the Western Hemisphere, meaning like Western Europe and Canada, in other words, to report on human rights abuses caused by mass migration. This is going to be a big deal, by the way, because what happens in Europe if you talk about it? Well, they might come knocking at your door saying, hey, did you have a license for that? Did you have a license for that opinion, mate? And they might throw you in prison for it. People are going to jail for posting things on Twitter or X. People are going to jail for stating things that are deemed offensive. And people are not going to jail for pretty serious crimes. What the U.S. embassies are going to start doing now in UK, in Germany, in Canada, is they're going to be documenting human rights abuses being committed against the actual people of those countries by migrants. Now, it notes here, millions of migrants and waves of deadly drugs have flowed to America's borders on transnational routes operated by terror organizations. Remember, the cartels are now designated as terrorist organizations. The Mexican cartels, the Venezuelan cartels, these are terrorist organizations. And it notes that these things are killing Americans. It notes that mass migration has endangered American citizens, threatened the economic security of American workers, meaning, stealing jobs, lowering the threshold of income because more competition means you can pay people less. And it says, and strained America's asylum system because there are a lot of legitimate asylum seekers. I know many people who would be legitimately murdered by their government if they went back to their countries. But a lot of people are scamming it. And unfortunately, what happened during the last 5 years, 6 years, going back a long time, you had organizations, NGOs, coaching people on how to scam the asylum system, even giving them pamphlets on what to say when they turn themselves into authorities. And of course, by doing this, they've gummed up the whole system and made it so that, while Americans, out of the goodness of their hearts, are giving asylum to people who don't earn it or don't deserve it or don't need it, and people who do need it, also out of the goodness of Americans' hearts, are possibly being sent back to their own countries at their severe risk to themselves, actually. Now, it notes the narco-terror organizations that facilitate mass migration routinely engage in child trafficking, forced labor, sexual assault, and other heinous human rights abuses that threaten the citizens of nations throughout the Western Hemisphere and undermine the rule of law. That basically the systems of mass migration have given billions of dollars to human traffickers, drug traffickers, cartels, and gangs. And these organizations have made up like literal bandits as they've taken advantage of people looking to enter the United States or Western Europe or Canada or other countries. Now, notes that U.S. embassies will report on crimes resulting from mass migration and urge governments across the Western Hemisphere to combat these human rights abuses. It says embassies will analyze government policies that facilitate mass migration or privilege migrants over citizens. Now, like some people would say, basically fix yourself before you try to criticize others, because America has these exact same problems. Right here in the United States, of course, there have been drunk drivers killing, Americans on a regular basis, sanctuary city laws that protect them, programs that make it so that if you're not documented on the system, you're let off with a slap on the wrist. People who murder, rob, cheat, whatever else the system, and get away with it. When it comes to these Somalis who've been defrauding America to the tune of literal billions of dollars, this has been known for over a decade. This was known over a decade ago, and it was allowed to continue. Policies have protected them. Policies have prevented investigations into them. Policies have stopped gang members from being deported. Americans have been abused, robbed, cheated, killed, poisoned, the whole 9 yards. And they're now doing something about it, but this is also a global problem. Of course, in parts of Europe where you have terrorist incidents, and they don't call it terrorism anymore, where people have to, put up barriers to block Christmas events from having people drive into them and murder people because they're so radicalized by their ideologies that they believe that murder is justified and will get them into heaven because they believe in human sacrifice, blood sacrifice. You have problems, of course, of migrant gangs that are grooming children, mass rape incidents in the United Kingdom. And not only is this relatively allowed to happen, at the very least, very little investigation, a lot blocking it, people calling it even racist when the government tries to act on it, you are more likely to face criminal charges if you complain about it than you would even being committing it as one of those migrant organizations or groups. So it says the U.S. government now is going to fill that gap. Embassies, it says, again, will analyze all of this. They'll be reporting on the crime and also looking at government policies that facilitate mass migration, which is a big deal. As I mentioned on the show previously, most countries are signed on to a United Nations program called the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. This was the system that America was part of, actually run partly by the State Department, so it's interesting the State Department has changed its policy now under Trump. It was a policy in Europe, which facilitated the NGOs to mass transit people on boats to UK and other countries. This is the policy in Canada facilitating it. It's the policy also in various Latin American, African, and Middle Eastern countries, which are helping facilitate this. Basically what it does, these countries pay to the United Nations. The United Nations then pays non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that facilitate all of it. This is an agreed upon global program paid for by your tax dollars to facilitate mass migration. So it's now interesting that they're saying here that the U.S. embassies are going to actually analyze the policies for this. We assume not even just the United Nations agreements, which America was part of as well, but also other local programs that have been facilitating it. Or it says giving privilege to migrant over citizens. In America, for example, colleges were using taxpayer dollars to give free college to illegal immigrants and migrants, while American citizens had to pay full price. You had different organizations that were, of course, allowing them to, get mass government handouts, while Americans didn't get anything. You have various programs that were favoring them over citizens. And so what they're saying here, the State Department is going to be actually holding countries to account to an extent, at the very least with transparency, saying things that these citizens of those countries are not allowed to say themselves without risk of imprisonment. And we assume that if America is going to be doing this, internally within the United States, they're going to be doing something about it as well. Otherwise, countries could say, well, look, you're giving us a hard time, but you have the exact same policies. America, still in many parts of the country, has the exact same policies. They're very slowly being changed. But this is not just a European problem, it's an American problem too. Now it says as well, the United States urges governments to protect their borders and defend their citizens against the human rights abuses caused by mass migration. Again, this is a very significant statement. They're suggesting that crimes committed by migrants, that the lowering of the quality of life caused by mass migration, the unaffordable rents caused by, again, increased competition for a finite resource, housing in this case, is a human rights abuse. That the lowering of income caused by mass competition for jobs, which allows employers to lower their costs or lower their wages, a huge problem with, for example, drivers for transit companies, huge problem in the blue-collar jobs, huge problem in the restaurant industry, huge problem in delivery jobs, huge problem even, of course, we get to H-1Bs and tech jobs. Businesses, because of the large amounts of people applying to them, are able to pay significantly lower amounts of money to workers. And so while the quality of life is being strained in terms of your ability to find a job and make money, the cost of living has been massively increased because of the competition for finite resources. They're now framing this as a human rights abuse. They're saying this is a human rights abuse, according to the State Department. And also drugs, poisonings, again, migrant crime, gangs, rape gangs, terrorist organizations, drug cartels, all of this is also being deemed as a human rights abuse. That the human rights of people of Western Europe, the human rights of Americans, the human rights of Canadians are being violated by migrants. It also says the United States stands ready to work alongside nations across the Western Hemisphere to end the global crisis of mass migration, suggesting that the United States is actually going to take some kind of action to do something to end this. Now, we'll see what that means, because America is not in any way on a track to actually even deport people who came here even illegally, let alone legally through other programs. But also not really able to resolve the problem of people illegally crossing and so on. Maybe they're going to do something about it. As of right now, a lot of the global systems are on hold, at least to America. They're still being facilitated to Western Europe, Canada, and elsewhere. But they're now suggesting that maybe this will be a broader policy. Maybe something is going to change, because if America is going to be engaging globally, it must mean they have a program that they're going to be offering to governments to help do this. That there's a plan, an idea that they want to get other countries on board with. Something is going to happen. The State Department is now going to be facilitating this, not even just in the United States, but globally. This is now a global US-led program to end what they call the global crisis of mass migration. Big deal, right? Now, on this point as well, Secretary of State Marco Rubio spoke about this recently. This is during a press briefing on December 19th, and he raised concerns over the problems of mass migration. Watch this.
Mass migration is highly disruptive to any country. We talked about it here in the United States. When you experience mass migration, I don't talk about immigration, I'm talking about mass migration. Okay, mass migration is a negative thing. It's not positive. And it's very difficult for any society to absorb and assume hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people over a short period of time, especially if they come from halfway around the world. There are cultural and assimilations issues related to that, etc. And so these are concerns that it's concerns I have about our own country primarily. It's been a priority of this administration to address this. But I think it's a growing concern in Europe. I mean, there are other voices in Europe and obviously in Australia as well that have expressed concern about this. These are facts. This doesn't make you anti-anybody. What it makes is you do have, as a sovereign country, the right to control how many people you absorb, how many people you allow in, and who those people are. This is a very basic sovereign right. Okay, it doesn't mean you don't allow any people in. There are people coming into this country every day to visit, to work, to live permanently, but you have to know who they are, and you have to have some limits and controls over what those numbers are. And obviously, because of some of the things we've seen, mass migration over the last decade has been highly disruptive, not just to the United States, but also to continental Europe, and in some cases in the Indo-Pacific as well. So I just think this is a real challenge that multiple Western advanced industrialized countries are facing.
Now, it's pretty big deals, right? Now, again, the problem we're facing in the United States is we're not fully dealing with it ourselves. They're trying to. It's being blocked in a lot of places. America is now going to try to enforce this globally. And again, that would mean that we would assume they're going to have some kind of global offering, some kind of global narrative, some kind of global issue that America is going to be presenting to make this not even just an American issue, but something, again, shared by other nations. And, the other problem with mass migration is that while mass migration is undermining the basic standards of living, undermining, again, the basic security, the safety of Western nations, a big problem of it also is that you have a lot of people legitimately fleeing very terrible situations. In many countries, there are horrible living standards. And again, Western countries have, for the most part, tried supporting those countries with humanitarian aid. This is not something they have to do, but it's something they have done. Creating standards of basic education, cleanliness, food security, basic systems of human rights. A lot of this is done through, again, organizations like USAID, also through the United Nations. And on the front of trying to actually improve the quality of life in third world countries, the United States is also going to be changing its policies on humanitarian aid through the United Nations. We'll be talking more about this after we come back from a quick break.
All right, just to pause here for a super quick moment. You are, of course, watching Crossroads with Joshua Philipp. I'm just here to share a message about American Hartford Gold, my own personal gold and silver bullion dealer. Now, obviously, the recent tariffs have made the markets super turbulent and volatile. With every new piece of tariff news, the market seems to either crash up or crash down. And of course, it's worth mentioning that these conditions don't only affect Wall Street. They affect all of us through our investments and our retirement accounts. That's why I'd like to introduce you to a company that I trust and I myself use to secure my own savings, American Hartford Gold. They specialize in helping Americans move our assets into something tangible, into something you can actually hold, which is physical gold and physical silver, two precious metals that act as a hedge against all those decisions being made in Washington, D.C. They have an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau. They have thousands of 5-star reviews, and they make the whole buying process super simple. Your metals can be shipped directly to your door, or you can transfer your current retirement account to a tax-advantaged gold IRA. And the best part is that right now, American Hartford Gold is offering an exclusive offer. When you call them today and you mention the name Joshua, you could receive up to $15,000 in free silver with your initial investment. Take advantage of their special offer. You can either just call them at 877-260-2764 or text Joshua to 65532. All their information will also be down in the description box below. And now, back to Crossroads.
Welcome back. Now, alongside the problem of trying to resolve the issue of mass migration by, again, spreading narratives in Western countries like the United Kingdom, telling people of the abuses being committed against the locals by migrants, the United States is also going to be looking to fix the issue that causes mass migration in the first place, and is now also changing its policies on humanitarian aid through the United Nations. And the goal of this, according to the State Department as well, is to save lives with less money. Fixing the issue that would necessitate mass migration in the first place, in other words. Now, State Department says this. Today in Geneva, the U.S. Department of State and the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, it's OCHA, signed a memorandum of understanding outlining a new paradigm for U.S. funding of UN humanitarian assistance. It's the landmark agreement made in connection with OCHA's humanitarian reset, meaning they're changing everything now and how they do things, reaffirms the United States' ironclad commitment to supporting critical, life-saving humanitarian action around the world, something America does not have to do by any means, but is doing out of the goodness of Americans' hearts. Again, making sure people don't starve to death and making sure people have some basic system of education and trying to make sure that there's some at least, basic level of human quality. It says it's going to be doing this all around the world while implementing vital reforms to make sure that the work is more impactful, efficient, and accountable to the American taxpayer. It's going to be important also because it ties into the whole scam being committed by NGOs. Now it says this, U.S. financial commitments made today are expected to provide life-saving support to tens of millions of people in dire need around the world in 2026. It says the United States helped found the United Nations, along with Alger Hiss and the Soviet Union, and has been both the largest funder of the UN system, the largest funder of the UN system, and the most generous humanitarian donor in history. It says, yet, as President Trump has made clear, the UN has increasingly failed to live up to its promise. While annual U.S. contributions to the UN have skyrocketed in recent years, reaching $8 to $10 billion annually in voluntary contributions to the UN for humanitarian assistance. In other words, roughly the amount of money being stolen by Somali scammers going to the UN. It says many UN bodies have abandoned their mission of promoting global peace and security, too often espousing radical social ideologies, again, ESG or DEI policies, race and gender policies. Instead of feeding the children, you're studying gender change programs of fish. It says also acting to undermine American interests and values, giving money to countries that may be not using it in any means that are, again, in value to the United States, and undermining peace, sovereignty, and shared prosperity. We've basically been paying for the noose to hang ourselves. We've been giving money to dictators. We've been giving money to NGOs, which give droplets of actual programs to these countries, take all the money, and then run global programs against American interests. It says further in, today's agreement is a critical step in those reform efforts, balancing President Trump's commitment to remaining the world's most generous nation with the imperative to use U.S. taxpayer dollars responsibly by reforming the way we fund, oversee, and integrate with UN humanitarian efforts. It establishes a new paradigm whereby the United States will replace the current unaccountable morass of projectized grants with a set of consolidated and flexible pooled fund vehicles at the country or crisis level. It says these vehicles will be administered by OCHA pursuant to comprehensive country-level policy agreements that will govern the delivery of UN humanitarian assistance in specific countries. It says of operations and ensure alignment with American interests and priorities. In other words, cutting out the middleman. The NGOs were the middlemen. Cutting out some of those NGO systems, the system whereby they take, all the cream off the top and give people the scraps. The system whereby we're funding international organizations undermining national sovereignty in some countries, and instead making sure that people get the actual goods that the whole thing is intended for. There's been a giant game being played where people say, hey, give me money and I'm going to feed the poor. You give them money, they feed themselves and give the poor their scraps, if really at all. It says these agreements will focus funding on hyper-prioritized life-saving activities, meaning we're going to be focusing on things that actually do something, not just, maybe building wells in Africa. Mr. Beast tried to do and got criticized for it because it made the country look bad for not building wells for their people. Making sure you're actually bringing food to people, making sure you're actually doing tangible things, not building golden camel statues in the Middle East, which they did, by the way. Not doing crazy things like doing transgender Sesame Street shows, which they did, by the way. Doing things that actually are to protect human life. It's going to be this, again, hyper-prioritized life-saving activities. Provide for powerful new impact, accountability, and oversight mechanisms, meaning America's actually going to be watching where the money goes finally. Enhance the efficiency and flexibility of humanitarian operations, and also better share the burden of humanitarian work across major donors. It says this new model will allow the department to manage humanitarian assistance more efficiently and to achieve nearly double the life-saving impact of each U.S. dollar spent on UN-administered humanitarian aid. Now look, this actually goes a bit deeper than what they're even saying on the surface. This ties into recent statements from the Trump administration, recent findings. And what was that? Most U.S. foreign aid, whether through the United Nations or through USAID or through just about anything, most of that money was not being given to the people who were in need. Most of that money was not being given to starving children in Africa. Most of that money was not being given to programs to help people suffering genocide. Most of that money was not being given to people who actually needed it. It was being given to intermediaries, NGOs, non-governmental organizations. These NGOs were being propped up, funded by American taxpayers, and the NGOs were then taking nearly all of the money for themselves, using it for their own operations, their own personal paychecks, giving very little to the actual tangible programs on the ground. I mean, some of these organizations, You give them $100, and you'll be lucky if they actually spend $1 on the people on the ground. You give them $100, and you will be lucky if even $1 of that is used for the issue they claim it's going to be used for. A lot of the money is used to fund this gigantic system, and they give very, very little when it drips down to the bottom. In addition to that, by funding these NGOs, the NGOs are not just focused on the thing the money's intended for. It's focused on a whole octopus, tentacle-like systems globally working on all kinds of programs. Facilitation of mass migration, political operations, things even undermining American interests, things trying to change the systems of global governance, things undermining national sovereignty. As we uncovered recently, a couple of years ago, when I was doing investigations even in Panama, where the government of Panama was telling us they were worried their sovereignty, the national sovereignty, was being undermined by the United Nations, by NGOs. These organizations are so powerful that they are more powerful than some governments, and they were using this money to fund themselves, to operate, and to do things that in no way were part of the intended operations that American taxpayers were being told about. This basically takes the money out of the hands of these organizations. This eliminates the middlemen and makes sure that when people receive it on the ground, they know this came to you from America. And a lot of the money is being used for stupid things also. Absolute nonsense programs. They were pushing diversity programs. They were pushing equity programs, socialism. They were pushing ideological programs, DEI. They were pushing things that really did not benefit the countries. They were pushing green technology programs, countries that really don't care about that. They were doing transgender programs for kids. They were doing weird experiments. They were doing things that did not have actual tangible benefits to people's quality of life. It was pushing ideology. It was pushing things that people did not want, and in turn, it was making America look bad. It also didn't typically make clear that useful aid was actually coming from the United States either. So when people received goods, they weren't saying, "Thank you, America." They were saying, "Thank you, NGO." Instead of saying, "Thank you, America, for saving my life. Thank you, America, for making sure my child had, baby formula. Thank you, America, for making sure I had clean water today." They're saying, "Thank you, United Nations. Thank you, NGO. Thank you to this globalist system that, while does not actually benefit us in many ways, made sure I stayed alive today." When in reality, it was coming from the United States. That's going to be changed now. They're going to make it clear this is coming from the United States. And it's going to be important too because, again, part of the reason for mass migration is the quality of life in other countries because of gangs, because of bad government, because of lack of resources, because of bad business practices. The quality of life is terrible. People seek refuge elsewhere. That causes mass illegal immigration, mass migration, even through legal means. That then undermines the quality of life in, first world countries. That problem is supposed to be fixed by the massive system being funded by the United States mostly, and a handful of other countries to an extent. Again, trying to increase the quality of life to prevent this in the first place. Because that has not been done, quality of life has not improved. All of this is now changing. And America on multiple fronts is trying to basically uphold what we stand for as a nation globally. That America is not just a system of, ultranationalism internally. We represent a global idea of basic standards of human rights. A global idea of what freedom is. A global idea that government should actually act in the interest of the people they govern. This is the American idea, and America is yet again pushing it. And also, look, speaking of aid to other countries, well, a lot of that has been happening right here in the United States, where illegal aliens have been looting the American social welfare system. The Trump administration is now looking to find any fraud in these programs, and is also looking to review and even possibly deport legal immigrants who have not shown themselves as a net positive to the system. If they've been receiving food stamps, if they've been on welfare programs, they've been getting Medicaid, they might get deported. Americans have been funding the quality of life of people who've been violating American laws or even coming here legally. and have been allowing them to commit crimes against Americans to live off the backs of hardworking Americans while really doing nothing in return. The idea now is if you come to America, you owe a debt to the United States. If you come to America, it is because of the goodness of Americans, and if you have not respected that, you might get sent back. And in the latest part of this, well, ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, they just got access to something very big. They got access to data on Medicaid, and this is going to be huge. Just the News said this: a federal judge ruled Monday that the Trump administration can share Medicaid information pertaining to illegal immigrants and with immigration and customs enforcement officers next month. Next month is coming up very soon, right? It says the ruling comes after 22 Democratic states sued to stop the government from sharing the information in July, which was granted while the case played out. Meaning 22 states, all Democrat, blocked this. And, their argument was basically it's illegal for the U.S. federal government to share data between agencies. Medicaid data cannot go to ICE. And they were saying this is an issue of privacy. The problem is, of course, as we've now been seeing with the Somalis in Minnesota, mass fraud has been committed against Americans. Mass fraud has been looting these systems meant to be paid out to, American citizens and elderly and people in need. People have been stealing it, people have been cheating, people have been taking it illegally. What this will effectively do is now allow ICE to look at all the systems, who is getting money, and even locate them. Because anybody who's been getting free health care, anybody who's been getting these programs, I personally know several illegal immigrants who get Medicaid, by the way, especially in California. This has in fact been happening. This has been happening for a long time. They can now get this data and even use Medicaid data to track these people, find out where they live because it has their addresses, and deport them if they've been receiving it illegally. It says the liberal states can still appeal the ruling, meaning these 22 Democratic states might try to block this from happening still. We'll have to see if the court gives an injunction on it or whatever else to keep the program on hold, but they have a time limit on that. It says the order approved, and by the way, it's going to be hard because what's happening in Minnesota right now. Government officials who have been blocking investigations into migrant fraud are being accused of committing fraud by blocking it, by blocking the investigations. Local government officials who've been preventing investigations, who've been blocking oversight, who've been allowing fraud to be committed, are now themselves being held accountable as basically having been part of a criminal enterprise. And so local states that have been blocking ICE's ability to actually investigate fraud could themselves see government officials at that level facing similar criminal investigations into what you're watching against local officials in Minnesota. Now it says here, the order approved an agreement between the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services and the Department of Homeland Security in July that allowed ICE officials to access the personal data of 79 million Medicaid enrollees, including home addresses, to track down illegal immigrants. And that's going to be a big deal also because, look, part of the big problem of deportations is finding them. It's the giant game of hide and seek. The problem is, if you're an illegal immigrant and you've been receiving government handouts, you've been protected from oversight because of various states that basically make it so the federal government can't access that. They've been preventing investigations. By allowing ICE to access this, they can actually see that you're an illegal immigrant and they know where you live. They will know where you live because you've been receiving these government programs. That's why it's such a big deal. Now notice that U.S. District Judge Vince Chabaria ruled that ICE officials can access 6 categories of basic personal information: the address, the citizenship, the immigration status, the phone number, the date of birth, and Medicaid ID. Where you live, are you an American citizen, meaning immigration status or not, legal, illegal, what is your citizenship status? Are you a born American? Were you naturalized? If you've been receiving this, even if you're naturalized, they might deport you. They're also getting your phone number. They can call you up. They know your date of birth. They know your information, your Medicaid ID, and they can now find you. And the Trump administration is saying they're basically going to be reviewing all of these people and deporting or even denaturalizing people who've been living off the backs of Americans. That's why this is such a big deal. Now, and that also ties into the problem that some people are elderly. You have a lot of people who migrated here legally, maybe got naturalized, and they're on Medicaid. And it's not clear how the Trump administration is going to treat that. In previous statements, it suggests that may be a gray area. Regardless of anything, they're looking at, have you been a net positive or a net negative for the United States? Are you improving the quality of life for Americans? Did you come here and benefit this country, or did you come here and cause a net negative for this country? They're actually going to be looking into this. They're actually going to be looking into this now. Now, like on the front of what ICE is doing, it's not clear what this data could actually uncover. It could also find fraud, by the way, because findings of mass fraud committed, as I mentioned, by Somalians in the various parts of the U.S. Some of this is in Minnesota. It's actually now being found in other states as well. And it's not even just them, by the way. It's other groups. There's been basically a mass plundering of the United States. There's been a plundering of the United States by gangs, cartels, scammers, illegals, foreign organizations, and even by some Americans involved in crime. It's also likely that similar investigations could continue not just into Somalians, but into other migrant groups as well, all across the country. The Trump administration right now has found a way to use a narrative that people are enraged about, to make clear the necessity for investigations and deportations. That's why this matters so much. Also, alongside this, the federal government is looking to ensure that, basically while this is being cleaned up, the American people are receiving better medical care. The White House said this, December 29th, "Today marks an extraordinary milestone for rural health care in America." It says the Trump administration announced funding awards to states through the Rural Health Transformation Program, an unprecedented $50 billion investment, roughly, 20% of, roughly, 5 times what's been stolen by the Somalis, right? An unprecedented $50 billion investment established by Republicans under President Trump's Working Families Tax Cuts legislation. It says this historic initiative, which every single Democrat voted against, represents the largest federal, this is Trump saying this, right? Represents the largest federal investment in rural health care in American history. Access to quality care should not be determined by your zip code. Today's announcement highlights the Trump administration's commitment to strengthening the rural health workforce, modernizing facilities and technology, and deploying innovative care models that bring high-quality health services to rural communities nationwide. Now, why does this matter? This matters in 2 different ways. One of them is the surface, one of them is the deeper side, okay? Let me explain. Now, first of all, this is the Trump administration saying, we're going to make sure that healthcare programs are available to actual Americans, not to illegals, not to whoever else. This is, through the White House itself saying this. They're going to be running a program to ensure that American citizens are able to access quality health services. This is targeting rural communities, not just big cities. Why does this also matter? It's because the Trump administration is basically threatening to withhold federal funding for healthcare programs to states that are not asking migration status for people when they try to get healthcare. This was one of the big issues, for example, in the recent spending. This was one of the reasons why Democrats shut down the government. You might remember the vote for that. And there were a lot of narratives on it, but this is what it came down to. Democrats wanted health care for all, right? Health care for all. Republicans wanted to make sure that illegal aliens were not getting American health care, American-funded health care, that American citizens are not paying the bills of non-citizens or illegal aliens. That was the basis of it. The problem is, now you would say that, well, under American law, that doesn't happen anyway. The problem is various states in the U.S. have created a loophole where healthcare providers are not allowed to question migration status, meaning they give health care to quote-unquote all. That was the big argument that led Democrats to shut down the government. That was the actual, real narrative with it. What the Trump administration is doing right here is they're bypassing the states to do an actual service that can provide this more directly. Something that kind of cuts out the middlemen, so to speak, and allows this to be given and ensured that it's given more directly to actual Americans. That's why that matters so much. All right, everyone, that said, I don't know, questions, comments, what do you think about this? Is this a great idea, a terrible idea? Let me know in the comments. Let's jump into some questions. And let's see here. All right, first question, Cassandra Olympiade. You're saying Canada is being crammed with what the USA calls illegals. I know, I'm so sorry, Canada. Look, if I was going to get deported and they were like, hey, time to go back to Somalia, I'd be like, time to go back to Canada. I don't know what you're talking about. And a lot of people are doing that, by the way, Canada still has super open, they've closed some of it. But there have been criticisms in Canada where if you want to apply for the mass migration programs in Canada, you literally just fill out a form. You can it basically works the same way as when America had the free app you could download to facilitate your entry to the United States, right? The one they call the home app, right? They basically still have that in Canada. They still have that. If you want to go there and apply for asylum or whatever, you literally fill out a form. They make it super, super, super easy. But Cassandra continues stating, most are young, healthy, working-age people who are already well-versed in how to scam the system. It is causing an even bigger shortage of housing than was previously, as well as rise in crime. No, it's a big problem too. I know a lot of migrant communities get mad at those people because they make them look bad. If you say that, I don't know, maybe 1 in every 10 are criminals, you could say 90% are good people, good hardworking people, but 1 out of every 10 would be a lot. I mean, I don't know what the actual percentage is, but in some communities it roughly works out to that. And when you have people mass migrating and then, of course, buying up all the limited real... I know Canada has a bigger problem than the United States does because a lot of the building codes in the major cities are really, really tight in Canada. It is limited housing, and because of environmental protection programs, they're not allowed to actually expand construction. Canada has it it's rough in America. Canada has it way worse. And so Canadians, I know, are really suffering from this. And I know that your local officials are not really, I know they're trying to, I know there's a lot of conversations on it, but they're not really doing it quick enough. Canada is in desperate need for more homes. And Canadians, I know the quality of life is rough there. Quality of the ability to find a job is rough there. So I do really feel bad for Canadians. I know it's hard right now. SD731, you're saying we need audits of all NGOs, transparency and accountability. Actually, we do. I can tell you it's actually interesting. So, look, in America, in the United States, we don't, until recently, we haven't really thought much of NGOs, right? These and non-governmental organizations. They're the kind of, we think they're like nonprofits, like whatever. In America, we don't really think much of the United Nations. We're like, oh, what the heck is the UN? There's nothing binding with it. Like, what the heck? When you go to other countries, it's way different. Let me illustrate this. It had been told to me previously, when I was like, well, what does it matter, this stuff? It had been told to me previously that if you go outside of the United States, especially to Africa, Latin America, or Asia, and to an extent Europe, the United Nations is more influential and more powerful than the governments themselves. And not only that, NGOs, which get money through the UN or through the US or whatever else, are sometimes more powerful than the governments also. And this is big. So let me illustrate my experience seeing this firsthand. A couple years ago, a lot of you know I did the documentary Weapons of Mass Migration. Me and my team, we went down to Panama, we went to Mexico, we went toured the US border, and we gained access to the migrant camps down in Panama. We went to the Darien Gap, we went to the Embera Indian villages, we went to the United Nations little town they had, which had all the NGOs, and we knocked on their doors and had some very strange interactions where they hid from us and were very unhappy with us for asking them what they're doing, which would be a normal question, I would assume. They didn't want to say what they were doing. During that investigation, you might remember that we interviewed the former head of Senafront. Senafront is like the kind of the federal the equivalent like a federal police force in Panama. And they're also the border security. They're also the military in Panama. So we interviewed the former head of that, someone who's was at the time tied in with the government still, a very powerful figure. It was a great interview, by the way. And the issue he raised during that interview was this. He said he was concerned the NGOs were undermining the sovereignty of their nation. They were so influential through money, through programs, through aid, through lobbying, that they were undermining the basic authority and the reach of the government itself. They were more powerful than the government. And one of the big arguments they had, so there were some of the basic migrant camps which the UN was running its operations through. A lot of those were Embera Indian villages. I never really put together why they did it through the Indian villages. Looking on it now, my only assumption, I don't know the laws of Panama, my only assumption would be that the Indian villages work under a different system of law than the rest of the country. And so you can make deals with them, I would assume, and you're able to do things you would not be able to do elsewhere. After they go to the Indian villages and you have the United Nations checkpoints where the illegals or the migrants could sign up for the programs to be trafficked to the United States, which I got on camera. You can go watch the documentary if you haven't seen it yet. They then sent them to various camps. Now, those camps were actually run by Senafront. And so those Senafront camps, which, we had to, it was not, look, they don't let anybody in those. It took us a lot of work to get access to those. It was very difficult to get access to those camps. They don't just let anybody in. It was a tough investigation. We got access to those camps. Those camps were run by Senafront. You had to go through Senafront checkpoints to get to them. They had to check your IDs. They had to make sure you're okay. It was a process, right? And you get into those, and then you had a lot of NGOs. As you saw in my documentary, they had tents set up. They had United Nations tents. They had United Nations facilities. They had tons of NGOs set up. Some of them for human trafficking, you could call it. Some of them for healthcare. There were doctors without borders and HIAS and all kinds of stuff was there. So you remember too that in the documentary we were actually knocking on their doors and tried talking to them, and nobody wanted to talk about what they're doing. As an investigator, I can tell you that when someone doesn't want to tell you what they're doing, they're probably hiding something, or they believe they're doing something wrong, typically. Or they just don't trust you. That's, being fair, maybe they don't trust you. Maybe they're like, oh, well, you're some crazy far-right organization. I'm not going to tell you anything. If they think you're not going to give them good coverage. But the amount of secrecy was crazy. The amount of people who told me you're not allowed to record me, You're not allowed to show this. You're not allowed to, you're not allowed to publish this. I said, yes, I am. Sorry, bud. That's my style. Watch me do it, which I did. But, they were very mad about it. They tried to stop me from being able to report this stuff. It was crazy, actually. But what I found was, so these NGOs were effectively having legal battles with the government of Panama. The Center Front was running these camps, and because of that, they were able to manage things in various ways. They had a certain amount of power to block certain types of migration. They had powers to vet people to an extent. They had powers that did not mean absolute open borders. And the NGOs wanted to overturn that. And so the NGOs were trying to seize the ability to run the camps from Center Front. And so when we talked to the head of Center Front at the time, he was telling us this. He was saying the national sovereignty of Panama was being undermined by the United Nations by NGOs. These were a threat to whether they're a country or not, a threat to their actual government power operating within their country because they had more money and they had more influence. And so, you go to some countries, NGOs are more powerful than the government. You go to some countries, they're trying to usurp certain government powers. And what I was also told by local officials there, is that the NGOs were also backing political candidates who were pushing policies in favor of the NGOs and against the interest of the actual government. So they were actually being involved in political systems. They were worried about it. In Panama, again, watch the documentary I did, Weapons of... You can watch, if you're on YouTube, you can watch it on Epoch TV. If you're watching on Epoch TV, you can watch it literally for free right now if you want. These groups were literally lobbying. They were literally pushing political campaigns. They were literally challenging, suing, filing international lawsuits against government agencies. They were doing what these federal judges in America were doing all around the world. And because of that, they were forcing these governments to change their laws. And what does it mean if you're a country and the whole United Nations comes down on you and says, hey, you need to change this program or you're not going to get money anymore. Hey, you need to change this program or you're out of this, and you become so dependent on it, you can't afford to lose it. They're able to puppeteer and alter your laws. And that's what was happening. Again, I was shocked. The NGOs have become pseudo-governmental organizations in many countries. Let's put it that way. And they're not being operated in American interest. They're being operated through this weird, globalist, global governance interest, being puppeteered by people who are not also not acting in the interest of the United States. And so it raised the point, geez, we're funding this? Anyways, sometimes I do investigations and the findings are just things I never thought I'd encounter. I never thought I would find that. But and again, in the media, a lot of the media would never tell you these things. And so to that point, a lot of people would have no way of knowing. That is why I personally believe very much in traditional journalism, meaning I get out and I go and find things myself, because you cannot depend on most media to actually tell you these things. You need to go look at it yourself and talk to people. There's so much that you are never told about. There is so much happening in the world that you would have no way of knowing if you didn't have independent journalists. Nobody would ever tell you. There's so much of it. And I can tell you, as an investigative journalist for almost 2 decades, when you look at the totality of the picture, it is overwhelming and shocking how much the public is not being told, how much the public is being lied to. And I'd say the real picture of the global system. And so from my perspective, when I see the U.S. government changing a lot of that, it really means a lot. The significance of what we talked about today is a lot bigger than just them saying, hey, we're going to we're going to, cut out the middlemen and fund things directly, and we have a new program to reset global aid. Like, it's a lot bigger. It's a lot bigger than what they're telling, than what that would look like. Because if I were to break that down, and I know I'm going long on this question, let me explain this. Based on what I just told you, based on what I saw, and based on the changes now being created, what does that actually mean? It means the ability of NGOs to act as pseudo-governmental, they're called non-governmental organizations, but they act as governmental organizations. Lawsuits, the weight of the UN behind them, the threat of financial ruin, the backing of political systems to undermine the incumbent political powers. They're disrupting even like the basic politics of these countries. The resetting of that system, the system whereby America will be replacing them. What does that mean? It means that America and the United Nations more directly, without these middlemen involved to a large extent. And remember, it's even beyond the UN systems. America's going to be doing this through USAID and other things too. So there's going to be some direct US aid programs. By cutting out the NGOs, it means that the United States itself will be projecting power and influence in these countries. And instead of saying, hey, country, you need to have a, transgender education program. You need to have open borders. You need to do this, you need to do that, or you're going to lose all your money. America can say, hey, country, you need to stop killing Christians. Hey, country, you need to stop censoring your people. Hey, country, you need to stop having, this or that goes against the basic constitutional ideas that America is founded on, or you're not going to get our money. It means that America will still project influence, right, in place of what the NGOs were doing, but in a radically different system, one that represents an idea of what America stands for, rather than the globalist ideologies of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and transgenderism and globalism being promoted by the NGO system. This is a global shift in what is being projected. You could call it the strings attached. There are strings attached. There actually are. And America plays it too. But you could argue that what America does is more in line with American values. And frankly, I'd say, you know what? Creating a global system of a basic interpretation of human rights, again, the American idea that the government exists to guard your God-given rights. That's not a bad thing to project. Good. I hope we do it everywhere. Because what is being presented right now is the opposite of that. They're changing it. That's why that matters so much. Crash Bandit, you're saying, Josh, I think the book, The White Man's Burden, I almost used that term today. I didn't do it, but you're saying talked about the money that gets wasted on NGOs in Africa and how it is a major scam. I never read that book. I've heard about it. The phrase, the white man's burden, goes back to the early days of colonialism, though, and just the context of it. But that actually is still what's being done. And it's not talked about like that. Basically, the Western world developed a lot faster than a lot of the rest of the world, right? That's just the reality of it. The Western world came up with different ideas of, call it the Enlightenment, the Great Awakening, call it even earlier than that, the effect of Christianity establishing and changing a lot of these savage states of Western Europe. Look at what the Nordic countries were prior to Christianization. Look at what Russia was prior to Christianization. The land of Mag and Magog, right? The land of darkness, they used to call it. The reason they built Hadrian's Wall, right? You used to have very savage regions. Look at what the British were in the time of early Rome. That was Western civilization prior to Christianization. Christianization really took away the savagery that existed in many of those countries. You could argue they're still pretty savage under that later on. The knights and the conquistadors and so on. They still had that fighting spirit. But the brutalist ideas, the age of the Vikings, right? 700 to 1100 AD roughly. that type of brutality, for the most part, came to an end. And the idea is when a lot of people in Europe in the 1400s were looking at, hey, geez, and look, when you think about the way this relates, like 1400 AD, when a lot of the colonialism was starting. Look, you had this was just after, at the time, a little later in the 1400s, just after the Spaniards retook Spain, just after the conquistadors, fought against was the Ottoman Empire taking it? This was like not long after the Age of Knights. This was only 300 years after the end of the Age of the Vikings. The memory of the Age of the Vikings was just a little further out from our memory of the American Revolution, if you put it in context of that. That's how recent that was for them. And so a lot of Europeans remembered, gee, a few hundred years ago, we were savages. And so when they went to other countries and they say, oh yeah, they're burning their wives. Oh, they still have cannibalism. Oh, they're having these tribal wars. And I had friends, for example, who went to Madagascar, for example. I'll just give you a couple examples of this, even not that long ago. And you had one of the warring tribes that just brutalized one of the other tribes, putting people in pits, and they would take relish in pouring boiling water on them and watching them die slowly. They would take glee in torture and murder. And, a lot of the world was like that, frankly. Frankly, a lot of the Western world was like that, even during the Roman Empire. And so in the eyes of a lot of the Western Europeans, it was Christianity that changed that. The introduction of an upright religion. And so a lot of people don't know this, but the settling of the Americas, not North America, but Central and South America by the Spaniards, that was a crusade. It was an actual mandated, approved crusade through the Catholic Church. The actual crusade was to humanize and Christianize the New World. It was an actual crusade being run at the time. And that was the idea, to humanize, in other words, to create a basic standard of human rights, and to Christianize, to spread the religion to the New World. That was the idea. Because they believed that the introduction of religion could transform savages into, modern people. People who recognize basic standards of cleanliness, human rights, and basic human rights, basically. Because, again, Western Europe had experienced the same thing. The age of savagery, to them, was a recent memory, which is why they recognized, hey, it changed us, we can do the same thing for them. They recognized the humanity in many of these people. And so they wanted to help them. In the way, and you can agree with it or not, I'm just telling you what they believed, right? So, as Crash Bandit notes, they called that the white man's burden. When they went to Africa and they tried resolving tribal conflicts, and which did involve sometimes killing the brutal tribes that were murdering and enslaving everybody. They went to the Caribbean, like Christopher Columbus, and they allied with the good people, the good tribes, and they killed the Canibs or the Caribs, which was the cannibal tribe. That was the cannibals of the Caribbeans. They would depopulate entire islands. They were genocidal. The cannibals of the Caribbean, when Christopher Columbus landed there, they were, you can actually read Christopher Columbus's journals still. Get the unabridged version if you do it, by the way. Do not get the abridged versions. They went to these islands. The cannibal tribes, and this is where the word cannibal comes from. I can't remember if it was the Canib or the Caribs. They would kill everyone. They would depopulate entire islands because they would mass murder, just brutalize everything. They would kidnap the women, and they would use the women as rape sources and as surrogate mothers so they could eat the children. That's what was happening. And so when people say, well, how dare Christopher Columbus kill these innocent, peaceful tribal members? He allied with the good people, and he killed those people. He killed the cannibals. And, again, and a lot of the problems were he was on a different mission than the Spaniards, okay? The Spaniards were a bit brutal. They absolutely were. And Christopher Columbus had ordered them to not do a lot of that, which is why they framed him and sent him back to Europe, actually. He was falsely accused of stuff and sent back because the Spaniards did want to commit some atrocities, which they did, frankly. And so that was kind of the real story of that. There's a lot you're just never told properly. And so again, they referred to that as the white man's burden. That it was the burden of the white man to create basic standards of living, basic standards of human right, basic standards of human morality in countries that they believed did not have any of that effectively. And you can agree with it or not, but that was the narrative. The real irony, as many people now say, is that the white man's burden has continued. Western Europe is basically funding a global social welfare system. Parts of Africa, food, clean water, basic standards of living and cleanliness are propped up mostly by Western money. A lot of Asia, the basic standards of living and basic standards of human rights are propped up by Western money. A lot of Latin America, despite the efforts of the Spaniards, is still propped up by Western Europe and American money and social welfare. We are still to this day the global sugar daddies. And the problem is they no longer see it as that. They see it now as they deserve it, that we owe it to them. And the global welfare state being funded by hardworking people in the Western world are effectively subsidizing the lifestyles in these countries. And that has kind of been the way it's worked for a very, very long time. Seymour Butts, you're saying, Josh, yesterday you mentioned that China... I'm sorry, let me go back to Crash Bandit. I'll jump into that again. Because Crash Bandit, you're noting that what the point you were making is that this book talked about how NGOs were basically scamming the system and wasting money. I just want to briefly say, yeah, that is true. I saw it firsthand when I was in Panama. And a lot of these organizations, they do not really do what they say they're going to do. They take a very small portion of it and use it for the actual tangible programs. And a lot of the money is used to pay their own paychecks and to fund their other programs, which oftentimes, are against American interests, in which push this kind of globalist idea of governance that also is very much against American interest. But Seymour Butts, I'm sorry. You were saying, Josh, yesterday you mentioned that China had a small window of time before the U.S. can still start manufacturing again. If China reacts, what will it look like? Yeah, so I said China, of course, has global agendas. They want to start wars. They want to make sure America cannot basically come back. They want to maintain the status quo whereby China is on the upswing and America is on the downturn. They want to take Taiwan. They want to push a global governance system of what they call the multipolar world order, which is China becomes the global government, basically. And America is just in its own little corner. That the voice of America, no pun intended with the voice of America, but the voice of America is basically a single seat at a very large table of every other country of what global governance looks like. America is no more influential than Ghana. America is no more influential than, Bangladesh. You know what I mean? That is the kind of system they're pushing. America is just one country at the seat of global governance. They call that the multipolar world order. And they're doing that by making countries effectively view America as the bad guy, pushing out American influence, pushing out American ideas of governance, going against the American programs of sanctions and so on, and trying to effectively eliminate us, not by defeating us militarily, but eliminating us by eliminating the influence we have. And by eliminating the influence, think of it as like you're not overthrowing a king, you're making the people of a kingdom no longer recognize the king, and then making them recognize you instead. They call this seizing the civil society. It's the goal of the United Front, which I've been exposing since 2008. seizing the civil society. That's the narrative of it. They're doing this on a local level and a global level. They call that on the global level, they call it the multipolar world order. So the Chinese Communist Party's plans for this, they just surrounded Taiwan. They've now moved their boats back. You could say, okay, said then done. It didn't mean anything. The actual timetable they have for that is probably closer to 2027, as is now being stated by some American intel agencies publicly. It used to be 2045 would be the time when the CCP believes it's more powerful than America and it can basically enact global communism under its ideas. The timetable for the invasion of Taiwan is roughly now, according to many sources, 2027. So look, it's almost New Year's, about 1 year out. The CCP has a window of time of about 4 to 10 years before the American manufacturing base starts up again. I'd say roughly 3 years before the factories come back in a tangible way, roughly 3 to 4 or 5 years before the mining operations for rare earth minerals, for iron, the entire logistical systems are built up, and roughly 7 to 10 years before the full military production systems are really firing in all cylinders in America. So they have roughly a time frame of being conservative, I'd say 3 to 5 years tangibly, where they could do this with relative risk to them. They would still have a rough time, but roughly 3 to 5 years where they could do it and possibly win. And so that is, I think, the timetable they're looking at. The problem is they need to basically get all their allies acting with them. So Russia would be one of them. And what do you see Russia doing? They're not ending the war with Ukraine. They're now expanding it. They're now creating new narratives where they're not interested in ending things. And they're probably going to be expanding it, right? You're going to watch Iran try to rebuild its missile arsenals. They can't get ballistic missiles. They're now turning to chemical and biological weapons. You're going to watch Maduro try to probably go into hiding somewhere and try to create an inter-regional power structure to push back against the Monroe Doctrine. Because America's trying to reestablish control of all of Latin America. You'll probably watch Maduro or somebody else try to create an intergovernmental pushback against the American incursion to reestablish the Monroe Doctrine, backed by China, Russia, and Iran, which have huge influence in Latin America, by the way. And you'll probably watch the CCP try to pull the strings of various intergovernmental organizations globally, BRICS, the power over like the African unions of states, the power over even the Latin American unions of states, and so on, in order to challenge, American colonial, the new American colonialism is what would be the narrative of it. You're going to be watching this kind of battle take place. So that will be one of the main fronts of this. The actual war will mostly take place through influence operations until the Chinese Communist Party has strong enough wartime production a strong enough base to get things out there. And also until they can get their allies, Russia, Iran, Venezuela being the main ones, get their allies powerful, and kind of Brazil right now because of Lula, make them powerful enough where they can at least keep America busy, keep us a little bit distracted, enough to split and divide our forces so that they would have the ability to maneuver and do their things. That is kind of the way things are looking right now. Now, could they do it? I'm explaining one side of it. This is the other side. Japan is pretty good with America right now. They would push back. Australia is pretty good with America. They'd push back on it. Taiwan is a pretty good fighting force. They don't get enough credit. Taiwan's a pretty formidable force if they wanted to push back. The Philippines is aligning more heavily with the U.S., they're an okay fighting force, but the big thing with them is that America would be fielding stuff there. Vietnam, they'd be a pain in the neck for the CCP. They're a bit of a wild card because they're not really American allies, but they're not really Chinese allies either. China has a lot of business there, but military, politically, and socially, they don't really like China. Western Europe, we'll see which way they go. They're actually pretty strong against the CCP in Russia. They don't really like America very much either. But they do recognize on a deeper level that they're a good ally. They're kind of like the neighbor who's got your back and works with you, but really doesn't like you. Talks bad about you behind the scenes, but still shows up to all your parties. They're like that. Same with Canada, right? They're a big U.S. ally, but they don't like us a lot, right? You have those kinds of countries too, right? You don't have to like us; you just have to love us, right? Anyways, that's kind of the other picture of it. And then America's trying to build up allies in these regions too. You're looking at America giving all this money to Argentina right now. People say, geez, why are we giving money to Argentina? Why are we bailing out their economy? It's because we're building regional allies. Why are we talking about regime change in Venezuela? It's because we're building up regional allies, that's why. Why are we making these deals with Bukele in El Salvador? Because we're building up regional allies, right? Ecuador is also kind of on the fence right now. They have a new president who's, I don't know where he stands with the U.S., but possibly representing that also. So America's rebuilding regional allies. Same thing with Africa, right? And on that point too, the reestablishment and redoing of the American foreign aid programs also means power is being seized from the NGO UN system, which I would say China and Russia have more power over the United Nations than the United States does. And so the UN NGO system and ecosystem is more supporting the European, Chinese, and Russian system of governance than the United States. So America, and a lot of the third world is controlled effectively by foreign aid. It's the reality of welfare. The person who is dependent is controlled by the person who offers the thing that keeps them dependent. You can enslave people through dependence. A lot of the third world is slave to dependence. Who runs the system of dependence? NGOs and United Nations. And so America now, like it or not, that's the case, right? I know it sounds bad, but like it or not, that's the case. America replacing that means the dependence will shift from this to this. And America will have more ability to change things. Look at what Trump did with South Africa, where he called in the leader and said, oh, showtime, let's watch a nice little movie I made. And he shows them the videos of the guy dancing around talking about how he wants to murder all the white farmers, right? Remember when Trump did that? Why did Trump do that? It's because he's saying, look, start following and acting in our interest, or we're going to cut off the welfare train, buddy. The gravy train gets shut off if you don't work with us. No more gravy train for you. And they're dependent on that. They can't live without it. Same thing with a lot of countries. Why is that? It's because dependence is a form of slavery. Dependence is a form of control. The UN and NGOs have controlled it. America's taking it back. And I know people say that, hey, that sounds terrible. Look, I'm not telling you to like it or not. I'm just telling you that's the way the world works. And America is, and I do think America offers a better system because we don't want really dependence. I don't think we do. I don't think America, if we wanted to be, we could achieve the dream of. We could achieve the dream of Caesar. We could achieve the dream of Genghis Khan. We could achieve the dream of every conqueror who dreamed of conquering the world, and we don't because we don't care. Why would we want to do that? We want other countries to stand on their own 2 feet, respect basic human rights, and leave us alone. The average American could not care less what the opinions are of those countries, could not care less about trying to colonize. We don't want that. What America stands for, though, is a certain idea of human rights, because Americans get PO'd when we see genocide. Americans get mad when we see, people massacring Christians. We get mad about that. Americans will defend basic human rights because there's just something in our blood. It gets us mad. And that's what American interest looks like. We just don't like seeing human rights of people getting slammed all over the place. We would love to see these countries being able to stand on their own 2 feet, and then we wouldn't have to give them money anymore. How many of you would like that? Really, tell me. You tell me, okay? How many of you would like to see us conquer countries and make them the 51st state? How many of you want to see South Africa become the 51st state? We're just do it, right? How many of you would actually want to see that? How many of you would want to see us not do that, but maintain a system of global welfare where your tax dollars support them and basically keep them running so we can influence them politically? How many of you want that? Or how many of you would like to see us establish a basic system of human rights and a basic system of living where their economy is able to stand on its own 2 feet and we can just do our own thing and stop giving them money and not have to deal with them? How many of you would want that? You tell me in the chat, because I can tell you I want the third one. I don't want to have to give money to them. I don't want them the 51st state. I want them happy, able to function on their own. I respect them, but I want them happy and able to function on their own. And I personally believe that's the opinion of most Americans, okay? As opposed to all these crazy other countries that want to dominate everyone. Americans really don't care, but we have a weird thing in us where we're like, we get big mad when we see people slaughtering people for their religion or suppressing freedom of speech. We don't like that one bit. And I do think that gets us moving, actually. We don't like it. By the way, also, I mentioned the documentary Weapons of Mass Migration, which, me and my team went down to Panama and Mexico and many parts of the U.S. to film. There's a lot of work doing that. If you want to watch that, we have the link in the chat and in the description. So if you want to watch that, if you haven't yet, I recommend it. Make sure to click that and check it out. Also, everyone, tomorrow is the New Year, so Happy New Year. We will not have an episode tomorrow because me and my team need a day off. We're going to go party, okay? And I hope you all do too. So Happy New Year. I will see you all again next week on Monday. So 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And until then, thank you all so much for being here. Please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.